sections. All right. So we talked about in class on Thursday your introductions, right? And the 3 common rhetorical moves of your introductions. Lead in, background article reference, and then the thesis statement. All right, so we talked about those 3 rhetorical moves on Thursday. And then the other part of your paper is you're going to have 2 discussion sections. And then your conclusion. So what we're going to do today on Thursday, we broke this down. We deconstructed this part of your paper. Today we're going to deconstruct this part. We're going to deconstruct the discussion sections and break those down. All right? So there's a couple things to keep in mind for academic papers. Oftentimes you're going to move from general to specific. Or you're going to make a point and then you're going to develop it. It's point plus development. All right? It's point plus development or moving from general to specific. Sometimes I like to think of it as an inverted triangle. Right? So over the course of your discussion section, this is probably what you're doing. Over the course of a paragraph, this is also what you're doing. A couple of you in your introduction, and I sent a note to you in your introduction when I was looking at it, and I said, we're going to talk about moving from general to specific. This is what I'm talking about right now. Your introduction, your paragraphs need to be organized both globally, talking about the paper as a whole. This is a global organization. But also locally within the paragraphs themselves. This is more of a local organization, moving from general to specific. And I'm going to show you how to do that. Okay? A lot of times students think organization means, well, I have 3 sections or 4 sections of my paper, and that's it. It doesn't really matter where the sentences go in the paragraphs. And that's not really true. You want to think about having a logical flow within the paragraphs themselves. And so we're going to talk about how to do that. So moving from general to specific or point plus development. Now you can flip this. You can move from specific to general. Some of your introductions might do that. So for example, if you started your introduction with a quote and you started talking about a specific event that happened recently, or if you were talking about, say, Texas education reform, finance reform, right? And the judge that ruled Texas education finance unconstitutional. And that was the first paragraph of your introduction. And then you went out more broadly in your introduction. That would be flipping this, moving from specific to general. And that works also. That's not an ineffective way to organize your introduction. You just want to make sure it's consistent and it's meaningful. It's deliberate. Okay? So here's what this looks like. To make a point, I guess this color will work, is going to be your topic sentence. This is the sentence or sentences in your discussion sections that make your point. All right? So what is the point of your first section of your paper? What's the point of this paper? What are we doing?
Wouldn't it be one of our purposes of education?
That's exactly what it is. So the purpose of this paper is to identify 2 purposes of education. So your first discussion section is your first purpose, right? So one purpose of education is enlightenment. That's a topic sentence, right? Now we're moving from general to specific. We need to get more specific. I like to think about it in terms of like math. We're getting to the least common denominator over the course of this paragraph. So what would be another way, or how could we get more specific when we're talking about enlightenment? Maybe explain it, right? I'm sure enlightenment means something different to you as it would to me. And since it's your paper, it's probably a pretty good idea at this point to explain to me what you mean specifically by enlightenment, right? So explain, interpret, analyze, clarify your point. So in other words, enlightenment is often perceived as what? How would you define enlightenment in your own words?
Opening yourself to new things.
Okay, being willing to embrace new ideas, challenge previously held views, look at an issue from various perspectives, and kind of understanding the context that surrounds certain events. That leads one to be an enlightened person, right? So that's a definition of enlightenment. Now, how can we get more specific here? What could we do that would be more specific?
I mean, like use our sources.
Sources for support, right? Now we can move into sources for support.
Now, does our interpretation need to reflect what sources we use, or vice versa?
Probably, yes. That way there's some sort of cohesion. So now you're going to move into sources for support. And what source did we read or talk about that dealt with enlightenment? Plato. So Plato would work here. Okay. Getting more specific. What could we do that's even more specific in this discussion?
Talk about something that Plato had wrote.
Yes, offering a quote for support. Okay? But you don't want to end your paragraph with somebody else's words, right? You don't want to end with a quote from Plato. You want to come back to connecting Plato way back here to your earlier point. We seem to have maybe trailed and we followed a rabbit hole in a different direction. Now we need to come back and bring our reader back to our point. How would we do that? Summary sentences, bringing it all together. Summary sentences that bring it all together. So if you think about it, you have 4 basic rhetorical moves that you're doing in your discussion section. Topic sentence, explanation, source for support, summary sentences, bringing it all together. Now this is one source for your discussion section. How many sources would I recommend? 2. Why? Why?
Gives you more to talk about.
Right? And if one is good, your reader might kind of go, well, that's all you got? Just one source talks about enlightenment? Or Plato's talking about it in a very kind of search for truth with a capital T sort of way. Is there another way to think about enlightenment that maybe isn't necessarily how Plato did?
Plato kind of thinks about it a little bit abstract, and you can take that abstract thought and put it into more of an application of how it applies to you as a reader.
Right, so what would be maybe the next source you would use to discuss enlightenment? What about the Rose article that we just listened to?
Yeah.
Right? He's taking Plato's idea of enlightenment and really kind of applying it to a more practical application today. An educated citizenry is an example of this kind of emphasis on enlightenment. Exactly right. So maybe my next paragraph, I would follow this same model, but instead of Plato, it would be Rose. Does that make sense? Kinda, sorta? Any feedback? Kinda, sorta. All right. So, if you notice, we're still moving from general to specific, making a point, and then explaining it, right? So this would all be one paragraph. And I would repeat it again for a second paragraph on Rose. And then I would repeat it again for my second discussion section on strong democracy, or financial security, or however conformity, if I wanted to go kind of this kind of contrast.
And discussion 1 doesn't have to be just one paragraph, does it?
No, how many paragraphs do you think this one would be?
Probably one or two.
You're probably looking at 2 paragraphs for each discussion section. You're looking at about 2, right? Because you need to use 2 sources, because that's what I said you need to do. So 2 sources, you're looking at about 2 paragraphs, but you would still follow for each paragraph the same rhetorical move, or the same organization. Now, how many sentences is this? Depends on what works for you. This isn't necessarily a recipe. These are rhetorical moves, which mean they could be, you could have an entire paragraph just explaining. You could have an entire paragraph just using a source for support. You probably won't need to for this paper, but if you were writing a longer paper and you needed to really go in depth in your sources, this could be, this part here just about Plato could be 2 or 3 pages by itself. If you had to write a 10-page paper, this part about Plato could be 2 or 3 pages. This part right here. Okay, make sense? All right, let's kind of expand on this part right here a little bit. I'm gonna just erase this. And let's kind of expand this out a bit. So within your topic sentence, explanation, source for support, summary sentences, bringing it all together. This part right here oftentimes trips students up. A lot of times they think this means just dropping a quote. Done, right? That's not what you want to do. You want to think about contextualizing your sources. So you need to put your sources in a context. You can't assume a familiar reader who has read Plato, who knows who Mike Rose is, who knows who Luis Rodriguez is from your textbook. You can't assume an unfamiliar reader, so you need to contextualize your sources or introduce them for an unfamiliar reader. I'm going to show you a couple of models on how to do that, but here's kind of the organization for doing that. Oftentimes what you're going to do is you will introduce your source. That means the first time a source appears in your paper, its first and last name and the title of the source where it comes from. First, last name, title of the source where it comes from. The first time it appears in your paper. You need to introduce your source.
Didn't you kind of introduce your source in your introduction?
If it appears in your introduction, that's where you would do it. But let's say this is kind of the first time you've really mentioned Plato and gotten, or Mike Rose, right? But if it's the first time and it's in your introduction, you would do the same there. You would just rewind this a little bit earlier. All right, introduce your source. First name, last name, title. You want to also paraphrase. Paraphrase their thesis. Just like I had you do today in the quiz. You were paraphrasing Mike Rose's thesis in your own words in about a sentence or 2. Longer text might require a longer paraphrase. Shorter text require a shorter paraphrase. Right? But paraphrase their ideas. Okay? Then you can come into a quote for support. Then it's a quote for support. And when you offer a quote for support, you need to include a speaker tag. Does this make sense? Yes, ma'am.
What's a speaker tag?
A speaker tag might be according or as Rose states, or as Plato, or as Rodriguez writes in his narrative. That's a speaker tag. It's attributing the quote to the speaker to avoid double voicing or to avoid a hanging quotation. A hanging quotation is where you just see a quote shoved into the text and it's not woven into the prose. You want to avoid a hanging quote. One of the ways is using a speaker tag. So if you hear me say hanging quote, that's what I'm talking about. You probably either needed a speaker tag or you needed to combine your quote somehow with maybe blending it into the sentences, maybe adding a colon, partially quoting, not quoting the entire sentence, that sort of thing. Does this organization make sense?